Hi everyone, today I have 4 new pantry challenge meals to share with you using pantry ingredients and food that we have grown and preserved. The first meal is going to be a cottage pie, which is the beef version of a shepherd's pie, which is usually made with ground lamb. The first thing I did was take care of the potatoes that I'm going to be boiling and mashing, and this goes on top of the cottage pie. And I'm just peeling a bunch of russet potatoes. I think I ended up peeling like 10 medium ones, and I will probably have extra mashed potatoes, but then we can always just eat them alongside another meal if we do. I just wanted to make sure I had plenty to top the cottage pie with. I'm just peeling those and cutting them into about 1 to 1.5 inch chunks. Then I'm going to salt them and cover them with water, and then I'm going to be boiling this on the stove until they are fork tender. After the potatoes have boiled for 20 to 25 minutes, I test them with a fork and make sure that it pierces very easily so that I know that they will be easy to mash. Then I'm going to drain the potatoes and add a bunch of stuff to them. First I have half a stick of butter. Then I'm going to add some milk. I start with about 1/4 cup and then add more if I need it to be a little bit looser. I also added some sour cream just because I had that on hand. And then plenty of salt and pepper. Once I have all those add-ins, I'm going to use my potato masher and mash these up. Now that the potatoes are taken care of, I can work on the rest of the cottage pie. First, I'm putting some tallow into my pan, and this is going to be my cooking fat to add a little bit more beefy flavor to the dish. Then I'm going to add 1 pound of ground beef. My ground beef was still a little bit frozen because I just took it out of the freezer last night, so this will take a little bit, and I'm just going to brown the ground beef. And once it's all nicely browned and pretty much cooked, I can add in lots of vegetables. I have some diced up onions, carrots, celery, and also some chopped garlic. So I'll add all those vegetables all at once into the ground beef, and I'll let those cook for a few minutes until they've softened. One other thing I added was some shredded zucchini that was in the freezer that I defrosted and drained. This will just bulk up the meal a little bit. And I also added some frozen green beans. Usually I would add frozen peas, but since I didn't have that, I thought the green beans would kind of take their place. I always like to add lots of vegetables, especially when a meal is usually very meat heavy. I think the vegetables are nice to kind of bulk it up and help that meat stretch a little bit more. I also added a tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, and then some hearty herbs would go really nicely here, maybe some thyme or some sage. I'm using dried rosemary that I'm kind of just crumbling up in my hands and then sprinkling into the dish. Once the vegetables have melded in nicely and softened up, I'm going to add a few tablespoons of flour and mix that in and let it cook a little bit. This is kind of like making a roux. The flour is going to combine with any of the leftover fats that are in there, and then we're going to slowly add in some chicken broth. And adding in the flour helps to thicken up the mixture so that it becomes kind of like a gravy once we bake this. So I'll just slowly add in the chicken broth and mix in between additions, and this is going to combine with the flour and make a really nice thick sauce for our cottage pie. I think I added probably about a cup of broth total. The filling will look a little bit liquidy now, but as it bakes in the oven, it will thicken up. And then I'm going to top off the cottage pie with the mashed potatoes that I made earlier, making sure to cover the entire surface. And then after I have enough, I'm gonna go in and kind of create these swoops using the back of a spoon on the surface of the cottage pie. And this will make it so that there are a lot of peaks sticking up, and when we bake this in the oven, those parts of the mashed potatoes that are sticking up are going to get really nice and brown. Then I'm going to bake this in the oven that's set to 400 degrees for about 20 minutes. And since I had the oven on, I also decided to bake a spaghetti squash. And I'm just going to put this on the other rack underneath my cottage pie. This will be for another meal later in the week, but I figured I might as well get it baked while I was baking something else. The cottage pie only needs about 20 minutes in the oven, and the spaghetti squash will need 50 to 60 minutes, so I'll just keep the oven on after I take the pie out and let the squash keep cooking. This is what the cottage pie looks like after the 20 minutes in the oven. You can see how it is nice and bubbly. That gravy has kind of thickened up, and the mashed potatoes are just starting to get little brown spots on the top that make it really pretty. This is a really great hearty winter meal where everything goes into the one pan, so it is pretty easy to do, and it's nice that you have everything all in one bite. You get your vegetable, your meat, and your potatoes all in one go. And since this is kind of like an Irish dish, Erin decided to have some Irish beer with the meal as well. And it was really nice adding all of those extra vegetables that normally don't go in there, like the shredded zucchini. That was a great way to use up our shredded zucchini in the freezer, and the green beans also worked out really well in them too. For the next dinner, I cooked up a quiche that has a bunch of vegetables in it, and I also baked some sweet potatoes to go alongside it. First, I'm starting off with the pie crust, and I had this pie crust in the freezer from last time I made something, because usually when you make a pie crust, you get two crusts, so I'll usually just freeze one. So I pulled that out of the freezer, and since it had been there for a few months, it was a little dry, so I just had to work with that for a little bit, folding it over a few times and making sure everything was nicely combined, and then I just did my best to roll it out. It was cracking a little bit, but for the most part I was able to work with it, and I'm just rolling this out into a thin layer. And then I use my pie plate to kind of measure and make sure that it is a few inches bigger than it on each side, and once it's the correct size, I can kind of just like roll it onto my rolling pin very gently and then transfer it over to my pie plate and roll it out. I'm gonna make sure everything is pressed in nicely, and since I wasn't able to roll my pie crust quite as thin as I would like, I'm just making sure that I can get it as high up the sides as possible and patching up any of the lower areas with any extra crust that I have from other areas. And then I'll go in and make a little bit of a fluted edge. Again, I didn't have too much overhang to do this, but I'm just going to do my best with it, and also try and push the top lip of that crust onto the pie plate. That way it won't slide down the edges. And once I'm finished working with my pie crust, I'm going to stick it in the freezer just for 10 to 20 minutes while I work on the rest of the dish. This is going to make it nice and cold and harden up any of that butter that has gone soft while I've worked with it. Next, I'm going to crack my eggs in a bowl. I usually start out with about 6 eggs, and then depending on the number of fillings I have, that might be enough. I don't want to start with too many eggs, because then if you have too much filling, you'll end up overflowing and having a huge mess. And 6 eggs actually ended up being perfect because I did add a lot of things into this quiche. So I added some salt and some pepper, also about a half a cup of milk. And now I'm just going to add in lots of different vegetables. First, we have that spaghetti squash that I baked the other day. And to be honest, spaghetti squash is not my favorite squash because it doesn't have a lot of flavor, and I find it too watery to serve with like tomato sauce like a lot of people like to do. But I found that quiche is a really great way to use it up. When it's baked in the quiche, the texture works really nicely for it. So this is one of my favorite ways to use it up. I also had some frozen kale that I'm adding in here. This is kale that has been blanched and frozen, and one of these little pucks that I have is about half of a cup, but will expand a lot once it defrosts in the egg mixture. I also had some ham in the freezer, and I took that out the day before to defrost. This was ham from Christmas, and I usually portion this out into like small containers so that I can throw just a little bit into different meals. And lastly, I have some frozen cherry tomatoes. Since my greens were very condensed and frozen into kind of like that puck shape, I'm going to set this aside while I work on the sweet potatoes that I'm going to be baking. So I have 4 small-ish sweet potatoes that are homegrown. I'm going to pierce each of them with a paring knife a few times, wrap them in some aluminum foil, and these are just going to bake in the oven while we're baking our quiche. It's a really easy, just like side vegetable dish that I can just toss in the oven. And those I'm just going to go ahead and throw straight into the oven while it's preheating to 400 degrees. Once it's time to bake, I can take my pie crust out of the freezer. I always find that it's best to have your pie crust as cold as possible before it goes in the oven, otherwise you won't get as flaky of layers because the butter will seep everywhere. So now that it's nice and cold, I can add my filling in there, and I really did end up with like the perfect amount. It was right up to like the maximum edge of the quiche, so it's a really good thing I didn't do any more eggs than I did. And it's also nice that putting all of those vegetables in there really stretches your eggs. Even though we do have our own chickens that produce eggs for us, they're not producing too much during this time of the year, and if you're buying eggs from the store, I know that they're very expensive right now, so adding lots of different things to kind of fill it up really helps those eggs to stretch. Lastly, I'm going to top the quiche off with some shredded cheese right before it goes into the oven. I'm not sure what kind of cheese this is. It's like some fancy smoked cheese that we had in the fridge, so I just used some of that up. And this is going to bake in the oven for quite a while, anywhere from like 40 minutes to an hour. And once it's all nicely browned on top and it's set all the way through, we can serve that up in slices. We also have our beautifully roasted sweet potatoes, which I just cut in half and serve with a little bit of a pat of butter and some salt and pepper. This meal turned out really well, which is kind of a relief because there was a casualty while making it. Next up, we're going to be having some burgers with some roasted root vegetables, but these are actually vegetarian Impossible burgers, and definitely one of the favorites that we had this week. So here's how we made them. First off, I'm starting off by prepping the vegetables that I'm going to be roasting. These are actually all homegrown vegetables here. I have a turnip, a China rose radish, sweet potatoes, and also some carrots. I'm just going to cut these into chunks and put them into my mixing bowl. Most of these vegetables, pretty much everything but the sweet potatoes, we actually harvested a very long time ago. I think it was like back in November, and they have been chilling in the fridge and doing really great. You can see that they store really well in the fridge, and that's why I always grow them in the fall, because we can harvest them and keep them in the fridge for months and pull them out and eat them when we don't have a lot of fresh vegetables. I also added an onion, and then I'm going to add some olive oil and toss the vegetables with it. Then I'm going to season them with salt, pepper, some cayenne pepper flakes, dried rosemary, and garlic powder. I'll mix this all together and then spread it onto a parchment paper lined baking sheet, and I'll roast these at 425 degrees for about 30 to 35 minutes. Next, I'm going to work on a burger sauce. I have 1 dill pickle that I'm going to dice up very finely. You could also do a spoonful of relish instead of the pickle. So I have 1 part of my diced pickle or relish. Then I'm going to add 1 part ketchup, 1 part yellow mustard, and 2 parts mayo. And this is the sauce that I like to make for burgers. It is kind of like a Whopper sauce or like a special sauce that you would get at a lot of burger chains. It's super easy to make at home and really delicious. So here's what it looks like when it is all combined. It's got that beautiful like pale orange color. And then we're going to cook up our Impossible burgers. This is what they look like. You buy them frozen, and you can either cook them from frozen or thawed. And it is really remarkable how much they look like real ground beef. We've only ever had Impossible burgers at like restaurants or fast food places. We've never cooked them at home, so we were really excited to try them out and see how they would cook up. I cooked them in a little bit of avocado oil, but I realized after I should have cooked them in some beef tallow, because that would give them that beefy flavor without actually eating meat. Of course, if you're 100% vegetarian, you can just cook them in any oil to keep it vegetarian, but since we're not, I cooked future ones in beef tallow, and I do have to say it did amp it up quite a bit. So I would highly recommend using some sort of like rendered animal fat if you do have that. Although it seems counterintuitive to cook a vegetarian patty with an animal product, I much prefer to have the flavor of meat without actually eating meat, and we're also able to use a lot of undervalued cuts of animals by rendering tallow ourselves. And those just have to cook for a few minutes on each side, and then I serve them on some homemade burger buns. I had added some cheddar cheese on each of these, and then I also topped them off with some thinly sliced onion and also some homemade canned pickles. These are the lemon pickles that I tried this year, and to be honest, they're not as lemony as I thought they would be. They really just taste like a pretty typical dill pickle. So not quite what I had imagined for like fresh snacking pickles, but they are great on the burgers. And then I also added some burger sauce on the top bun. And then I almost completely forgot that I wanted to add some of these alfalfa microgreens. I started these in a video 1 week before this, so after a week they were ready to harvest, and I just go in with some scissors and snip right above the soil line. And since we don't have any lettuce at the moment, these microgreens will be perfect to just give you a little bit of fresh, crisp green flavor. And then I'm going to cut this in half and show you what the inside of the patty looks like, because it's just incredible. Nobody would know that this was not real meat. Honestly, like, what a world we live in. It is absolutely amazing, or should I say impossible? I'm not gonna lie, we had that meal like 3 more times that week because it was just that good. If you can find these at your grocery store, definitely try them out. And if you can't find them, whatever you do, just don't buy Beyond Burgers or Beyond Meat. It is definitely not the same, and Impossible is way better. For the last meal, we're going to be having some brothy beans and greens and also some homemade no-knead bread. We'll start with the bread dough, which has to be made 8 to 24 hours ahead of time, so I usually do this the night before. Here are the ingredients and the instructions for it, and this is going to be a no-knead bread loaf. It is the easiest bread you will ever make, and it is really delicious. I'd say if you are trying to go for like a sourdough loaf, but you either don't have the time or have not been able to get the hang of sourdough, this bread is definitely worth a try. So I'm starting off with my flour, and I'm using half all-purpose flour and half whole wheat bread flour. And then from there, it's just salt, instant yeast, and some warm water. And I just mix this all up in a bowl the night before, and this will sit on the counter overnight. You can either do this like the morning of if you're going to cook it that evening, or let it go a full 24 hours. And the longer it sits, the more flavor that's going to develop. You're going to get a little bit of like that tangy flavor you would get from a sourdough. But even after 8 hours, it's still pretty good. And I just mix this up with like a rubber spatula and get it so that everything is nicely combined. But you can see the dough is not smooth at all. It is definitely like a very shaggy dough, and that's totally okay. You just have to combine the ingredients, and as they sit, they will develop that fermented flavor and the gluten will develop all on its own. Another thing that I prepped ahead of time was I soaked the beans that we're going to be cooking. These are actually homegrown heirloom beans, and I have been so excited to cook these up. I wanted to wait and do it in a video just so that I could show you what they cooked up like. I made sure to take a handful of these out to save to plant again next year in case we really like them, because you can just plant these exact beans as seeds. So to prepare them, I just rinse them off to get any like dust and debris off. And also once I cover them with water, I can see if any of the beans float to the top. I can feel if they feel like very hollow, and I'll take those out because those won't cook up very well. And then I usually let those soak for 8 hours to overnight. Later in the day when it's time to cook the beans, I've prepped a bunch of aromatics. I have a couple of onions which I've sliced in half, also a head of garlic which I have sliced crosswise to expose all of the insides of the cloves, and also half of a lemon. In a pot, I'm going to add a few tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, and then I'm going to be adding all of these ingredients that I've prepped and kind of like fry them off to infuse the oil with their flavor. I am basically following Alison Roman's method for making brothy beans. I will link her video down below. So here's what everything is looking like after a few minutes. They are starting to get nicely browned and they're developing some flavor at the bottom of the pot. I've also added some red chili flakes, and here's what our beans look like after their soak. They have really plumped up and have gotten like really round. They look really cool, and I'm excited to see how they cook up. I'm adding them into the pot along with enough water to cover them and plenty of salt and pepper to season them. And this is going to be a pretty simple way to cook these beans, but since we've developed flavor in the very beginning by having those onions and the garlic and the lemon, that will help to flavor the beans and create a really nice, beautiful broth. I'm going to leave the onions and the garlic in there to cook for the entire time the beans are cooking, but after this has come up to a boil, I will remove the lemon wedges just because I don't really like the bitterness that you can get if you cook the lemon peels too much. But the rest of this is all going to sit on the stove for about like 2 hours. This can depend on the kind of bean you're using and how fresh they are. So you kind of just have to check them every like half an hour or so after the first hour has passed and see how they're doing. It's definitely a longer and slower process, and if you want to speed it up, you can always use a pressure cooker or an Instant Pot, and these beans would probably cook in like 15 minutes. But sometimes I really like the slower, old-fashioned way to cook things. There's something very comforting about having just this like pot of beans simmering away on the stove on a cold winter weekend. It's also really nice to give these really precious homegrown beans that extra layer of special care, and it does make your house smell really amazing while it cooks as well. While this is going, I can now bake the bread, and here's what our dough looks like after sitting overnight. I haven't done anything to it, and you can see it looks very different from when we last left it. It has really expanded and has kind of gotten bubbly, and it's developed a lot of its own gluten without having to go in and knead it. So I just like to sprinkle the top of the surface with some flour just so it doesn't stick to me too much. And then I'll start to lift it up out of the bowl and let the edges tuck underneath themselves. This is what I like to do instead of flipping it out onto a surface. Honestly, just because I'm too lazy to dirty up another cutting board or surface to form the balls, and I find that this method works really well. All I have to do is just like keep picking it up, turning it 90 degrees and picking it up again. You'll see that as I do this, the sides will tuck under themselves, and this will start forming some nice surface tension on the top of the dough. Having good surface tension is really important to have your dough expand nicely and have a really nice domed top. And this is just a really easy way to do it, and I can just do it all in the same bowl that this was all mixed up in. So once I've done this several times and the top of the ball is looking really nice and tight, we can bake this in our Dutch oven, which has actually been preheating in the oven that's set to 450 degrees for a full half hour. You want this to be like ripping hot when you put the dough in. And usually Erin helps me out with this so that we can do the process really quickly. But you just put the dough straight into the Dutch oven and cover it right back up and put it back into the oven. Then it's going to bake for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, you remove the lid and let it bake further for about 10 minutes. And this will help you get a really crispy crust on this bread. You will definitely have to let this cool down for at least half an hour, probably about an hour. Don't cut into it too soon because this will ruin the texture on the inside. But after it's cooled off, I am cutting into it and you can see how beautiful the inside looks. It really does look a lot like a beautiful sourdough bread. There is a lot of gluten formation. It's got like a really nice chewy texture to it and has a little bit of that tangy fermented flavor. The outside crust is also really beautiful. I'd say it's not quite as crispy as a proper sourdough would be. It's like 80% of the way there, but it's like 10% of the work of an actual sourdough. And for how little work it is, this is the kind of bread that I've been gravitating towards making a lot recently because it's just so easy and so delicious. So I would definitely give this a try if you have never made this bread before. I think anyone can do it because you really don't have to knead it or do anything at all. It kind of just makes itself, which is pretty incredible. Meanwhile, here's how the beans are looking, and I have just tested them and they are perfectly done, creamy all the way through. So I'm going to fish out any of those solids that I don't really want. So I'm going to remove the onions and the garlic. These have done their job and have flavored the beans while they've been cooking. So thank you for your service, but we don't need you anymore. And then I'm going to add some frozen kale. And it doesn't look like too much, but since I really compact these when I freeze them, it will be a nice amount of greens to finish off these beans. And we're pretty much just going to serve this in its own broth since they have so much flavor. But before serving, I'll also top off with some extra virgin olive oil. The beans can really use it since they are a very lean protein. They don't have a lot of their own fat, so just adding a little bit of extra fat really helps to amp it up a little bit. And then I also add a fresh squeeze of lemon juice and some salt and pepper. On my bowl, I also like to have a little spoonful of sauerkraut on there as well, and then we serve it with our beautiful no-knead bread. It was so cool to cook these homegrown heirloom beans. This is the first time we've grown like a pretty significant number of dried beans, and they're still really beautiful after cooking. They lose a little bit of like that speckly pattern, but they're still a really beautiful like reddish brown color. And these beans are just so like round. I don't know how else to put it, but when you eat it, it's like such a different texture than a lot of the other beans that we've had because they're so plump and circular. They still have a lot of texture to them, so they're not like fall apart, tender, or creamy. They have a little bit of a bite to them. I actually used to not like beans, and back then, if this is the bean you gave me, I probably would have hated it. It's definitely like a beanie bean, but thankfully now that I do like beans, I really enjoyed these. I think it's really fun to try out different heirloom beans, and I'm excited to grow more of them this year. So yeah, that finishes off the fourth meal for this video, so I'm going to end it here. I hope you guys enjoyed seeing what we ate this week. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you again in the next one.